One of the most challenging aspects in the energy sector isn't necessarily producing the energy as much as it is in storing it and transmitting it. The ability to get the power where it needs to be and storing it there can be the limiting factor on how clean our energy sources can be. So today, we're talking with a company that is working on that challenge. Hey everybody, this is Chris Brandt here. Welcome to another FUTR podcast. Today we have with us Chris Larsen, Senior Director of Clean Energy at Dynapower, a company that is connecting power to purpose through clean energy storage and conversion systems to make our clean energy future a reality. So let's talk with Chris about how they are doing this. Welcome, Chris.
Chris, thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me.
Too many Chris's. We're going to have a concentration of Chris's on this.
There you go. There you go.
I don't interview too many Chris's. It's funny. But yeah, I'm super excited to have you on. I think you guys are doing some really interesting things. So before we get into all that, can you just outline, like why you guys are in this business and what you're doing there, and why clean energy solutions are kind of important to us now?
For us, it's foundational, right? So it's in our tagline for the company, right? Dynapower, powering a clean planet. So it is core to what we do, and I would say that it's been an evolution for us. Honestly, we weren't always what we would describe as a clean energy company. We've been around since 1963. It's a really interesting story.
Clean energy wasn't a thing then, right?
It wasn't a big thing. And of course, the first solar modules, I think famously were invented by Bell Labs in the 1950s, but it really wasn't until the 1990s that the industry started to pick up steam. And, we were around in the 1960s doing all kinds of really interesting industrial work. And that's a whole fun, interesting, evolutionary story. But for us right now, it really is the rallying cry within the company, and sort of our mission and purpose is to help enable green, clean energy technologies. And when I say enable, I should be clear that as you mentioned in the intro, what we're really all about is the storage side of the equation, right? So we're not ourselves a solar energy company, but the reason I joined Dynapower 9 years ago was because I consider myself a solar guy. All right, so if you look at my DNA, I identify as a solar guy. All right, so I came to Dynapower because I realized that, hey, this solar industry is doing what it's supposed to do. It's growing rapidly. And we'll get to a point where the limiting reagent is the ability to store that solar energy, right? If you have upwards of 40% of your power on the grid coming from intermittent resources, that being wind and solar, which is a reality right now in countries like Denmark, where approximately 51% of their power is coming from solar. So how do you deal with that? Because that can create havoc on the grid. And so that's where energy storage comes into play. And sort of that's been where we've made our contribution to the clean energy industry. And I think it's a little broader than that, because for folks who are actually familiar with Dynapower and our legacy and the work that we still continue to do today, they'll say, well, wait a minute, you have a whole other division, the power systems division, which is doing really interesting work in industries as varied from defense to mining to industrial metal finishing to steel. And the common denominator there is that it's not solar, it's not wind, it's not hydrogen, and yet it's part of the cleaning up, the electrification of those industries is also one of the pathways, one of the important pathways to, this carbon net neutral world that we envision. I mean, one stat that I was recently reminded of, Chris, which is stunning, is that I think it's maybe 8% of global CO2 emissions come from the steel industry.
Yeah.
So, all right, we need to be installing as much solar and wind as we can, and hydrogen. Yes, amen to that. But we need to be going inside of these industries that are major contributors to CO2 production and other pollutants. And what can be done to help clean up, so to speak, some of these industries. And oh, by the way, an important footnote on mining. People say, well, mining, boy, isn't that dirty? But guess what? If you don't have any mines, you don't have any copper. And if you don't have any copper, you don't have any solar. So there's a whole food chain here. And I think that, we are very proud to be part of what what is universally recognized as clean energy, right? Energy storage for solar, for hydrogen, for wind, but then also we're heavily involved in these other industries that have a pathway to becoming a bit cleaner.
I've talked to a bunch of companies recently, and ESG is at the top of the mind for the C-suite and the board level. There's always these conversations about, how are we being, responsible in the way that we're producing things, or consuming things, And I know that, one of the reasons why fossil fuels have stuck around for so long, I mean, it is kind of archaic in a way, if you think about it, where, exploding things in a chamber to get, the motion out of it, but the thing that's nice about fossil fuels is they're easily transportable.
Yeah.
And, they produce a lot of energy for what you transport, right? And that's kind of where it's really in the storage and transmission of things where, like the desire to produce clean energy often comes undone.
You nailed it, Chris, because you're right. The natural gas, petroleum, coal. These are that's the energy source and the storage all basically rolled up in one. So you're right in terms of functionality. What we're the petroleum that we're using, natural gas is it has some very favorable characteristics when we think about sort of the infrastructure side of things. So you're right. When we look at renewables, and again, let's set aside for the moment biomass, where inherently there is storage involved there. That's a fuel that can be thrown in bins and stored.
Right,
but if we really think about the primaries, so to speak, which are solar, wind, and hydro, storage and transmission become the limiting reagents. So it's I've referenced the case in Europe where they are well ahead of us in terms of penetration rates. And they're wrestling with this right now, how to have a stable grid, right? The transmission element, how to time it, have the power when you need it. And so that's why we're seeing this energy storage, and I'm talking about batteries in this case. So battery energy storage, and now hydrogen energy storage, really getting a lot of attention, a lot of investment, right? So actual investment. And also attention from governments, right? We're seeing programs that are, and this is not brand new. This has been happening for a number of years now. But programs, the U.S. government, the EU, and other countries are taking concrete steps to accelerate the storage market. Now, there are all kinds of challenges, but there are a lot of really smart people, a lot of smart companies that are working on this. And I'll tell you a lot, Chris, it's fun. Where we sit in this space, we're in the power electronics people, right? So we do all the conversion, right? If anything needs to go from AC to DC or DC to AC or DC to DC or frequency converters, that's what we do. And so in a sense that we're sort of agnostic to the storage chemistry. And that's important because it doesn't mean that we don't care. It actually means that we get to interact with and learn about all these new technologies that are coming into the market. So I almost feel like we have our own technology advancements that we're working on. How do we make our gear more reliable, more efficient? All these things that we're working on, but we also get to touch and interact with these storage companies, hydrogen companies, lithium-ion battery companies, non-lithium-ion batteries, and we get to see a lot of cool stuff. And that's one of the fun parts of our job. But back to your point about sort of the corporate focus on this sort of world of clean energy. It's not just a nice to have anymore. Right. I mean, the Wall Street values this, and that's another big just mega trend that Wall Street values companies that are leaning into this space. And the classic example that I like to refer to is NextEra Energy, Right? This is what used to be just another stodgy old utility.
Yeah.
Right? Florida Power and Light, is the NextEra is the holding company.
Yeah.
And we've done a number of projects with them, and I really respect the way they jumped in, years ago. I don't know when they really got in heavy, but they got heavily invested in wind power, and I believe that they still might be number one or number two in terms of owned wind power assets. But what you see when you look at their PE ratio, as a company, they are light years ahead of all the other utilities. And it's because Wall Street values the work that they're doing in clean energy and sees that is the future. And so this company, which has a great head start, again, I'm talking about NextEra, is being rewarded by Wall Street. And I think that's a really cool trend to see going on right now.
The cost of renewables has come down so dramatically, and the trend it's taking, you can see sort of that inversion of where it was cheaper to use the fossil fuels, and now these other technologies are becoming much more cost effective.
When those curves crossed, and again, I don't know exactly when that was, Chris, but it was, I'm going to say, order of magnitude 5-6 years ago. I mean, you may know, I don't know when that actually happened, but when it was the hybrid solar plus energy storage, the price of a, which again, that's important. You can't just look at the solar, you've got to look at the solar plus the storage so that the asset becomes dispatchable and quote unquote, useful and valuable to the grid. That's really the only way you can compare solar to natural gas, right? It has to have storage. And so when the cost of solar plus storage became less than, on a kilowatt hour basis, the less than natural gas, that was a big deal. And it's funny because now, I mean, just fast forward a few years later, we kind of shrug our shoulders that we take for granted that renewables are actually less expensive than natural gas. And we need to pinch ourselves and say, wait a minute, did we just say that? And it's so it's really exciting to see the forces sort of converge. But holy smokes, we still have a long way to go. We have a long way to go right now. And we celebrate these gigawatts of renewable solar, wind, energy storage that are getting installed, and it's fantastic. But boy, if you look at a pie chart, you know this. If we looked at a pie chart of it's renewables is still a small, non-trivial, but small part of the overall, equation in the U.S. And so we have a long way to go. And that gets to your point about transmission, right? You can't just stick this in the middle of nowhere. Well, you can with a whole lot of caveats. I mean, we could talk some about this project in Utah, which is it's not in the middle of nowhere. But yeah,
I definitely want to get into the Utah project because that is a really interesting one that we were talking about before. But before we get there, I just want to sort of point out, like, I think when most people look at the energy sector, they think in terms of automobiles, right? It's like gas in the car. It's very relatable to everybody.
Yeah.
But the thing that's, and then we look at some of the technologies that have come along with that. We've got, now electric vehicles, and it's challenging because it takes, half an hour to charge your vehicle up or whatever. And you got to have access to a supercharger. Hydrogen, you got like compressed hydrogen, which is, got its challenges, like producing and putting the hydrogen in a car is challenging. There's all that stuff, right? But if you look at hydrogen in a different context, and when you're looking at hydrogen at scale, when there's, you're generating power for a city or something like that, the challenges are very different, right? The storage potential changes in how you can approach things like hydrogen. And I think that leads us into the Utah project. Talk about that, because that's a really interesting one.
Yeah, so the Utah project, it's called the ACES project, ACES, the Advanced Clean Energy Storage Project. And I think it's a cool story because this is a project that present tense, this site exists, and it's a coal plant. It's a coal-fired power plant, and there is a direct transmission line. It's an HVDC line, which is fancy talk for high voltage direct current. So it's a more efficient way of transmitting power. But there's a line that goes directly from this coal plant in basically northwest western Utah straight to Southern California, to Los Angeles specifically. So most of the power from this facility is going to the Los Angeles Department of Water, LADWP, the utility down there. So the concept now, Chris, is, all right, this site, there happens to be a massive salt cavern, or actually two massive salt caverns under this site. And they are right now looking at doing a couple of things. One, replacing the coal-fired plant that's currently there with gas turbines. So, and oh, by the way, they're going to be upgrading the HVDC transmission line, but that's sort of a side discussion. But they're going to be changing out from coal to natural gas. But the interesting part of the story is that at the same site, they are going to be producing hydrogen using electrolysis and using solar electricity. So it's green hydrogen, producing hydrogen, storing it in these salt caverns that are right there, and these salt caverns are massive. And so they're able to store the hydrogen there, and they'll be burning the hydrogen initially as a blend in these turbines. So the turbines will be running 70% natural gas, 30% hydrogen. Eventually, that will change to 100% hydrogen. So these turbines are designed to take 100% hydrogen. These are being provided by Mitsubishi. Is the I was about to say the kingpin of the project, but anyhow, they're the major contractor for the hydrogen part of this as well as the turbines. So what's fascinating, I think that the part of the story that sort of blew my mind when I first came to understand this project was the storage is so enormous. These salt caverns are so enormous that they can store, I believe it's over 300 gigawatt hours of electricity, which, that's enough power to run, the state of California for a couple of days. Like it's a massive amount of energy. And, when you translate that into batteries, I think the count that I'd seen was 80,000 40-foot containers of batteries. That's so for the battery storage folks, that's again just mind-numbing. It's a crazy number. So what's cool about this is that now
the mine is the battery at that point, right? I mean that is the battery.
It is. So it's a storage project. We think we're creating green hydrogen, but it's a storage project, but it's storage on a new scale where it's seasonal storage. We talk about, hey, long duration storage. Hey, that's 10 hours of storage. So we can take this energy from the daytime, store it, and then we'll have it available for the peaks in the evening and the early morning. Okay, that's great. Now we're talking about a whole new sort of dimension to storage, seasonal storage, where we can take power that's produced in one time of the year and then basically generate electricity and export it when it's needed at another time of the year. So really a fascinating concept. And what I love about it is that they got the financing. This thing is going forward. This thing is under construction. And, we know this because we're providing the rectifiers for the project, and we've already shipped half the rectifiers to the site. So this is actually happening.
And for people who don't understand electronics, rectifiers do what? We were talking about AC and DC current here. So rectifiers do what?
Okay, yeah. So basically, they are taking the AC power from the grid. So when I say rectifier, there's actually a transformer there too. So the grid power there is, I believe it's 34 kilovolts AC. So we're taking that, dropping it down to low voltage AC, and then converting that AC to DC. And the DC is then fed into the electrolyzer. So somebody else makes the electrolyzer, and we're feeding it high current DC to split the water molecule, that H2O. So there's a certain the molecular energy is tied up in that molecule. So takes energy to split that. And so the high current DC is needed for that process.
You're taking a salt mine and just stuffing it with hydrogen. And I think one of the things that's historically been a challenge with hydrogen, if I'm not wrong, is that hydrogen is such a small molecule. It leaks out of things really easily.
Yeah.
Do you get much of that, or is it just the scale at which you're operating? That leakage just doesn't matter in the big scheme of things?
I was about to. I'm going to give you a smart ass response. Hey, that's somebody else's problem. We do the rectifiers, but no, it's a good question. The way in my limited understanding, I've got a mechanical engineering background, so geology, I'm not really up to speed on this. My understanding, though, Chris, is that they're able to control that by the pressure under which the hydrogen is stored. So.
Gotcha.
But obviously leak detection is a big deal, and so they've got a smart crew that's working on that. That's drilling the wells down and making sure everything is tight. But you're right, though, that issue, what you're talking about is a major deal for the industry, because there's all this talk about, well, hey, can't we just run hydrogen through the gas pipelines? We've already got the gas pipelines, and the answer is, well, kind of. Like most gas pipelines throughout the U.S. or globally today, you can safely or easily inject about 10% hydrogen before you get into leakage issues. But there's a whole effort going on right now. How do we address the pipelines so that they are robust? Because as you point out, that hydrogen molecule is tiny. It's
tiny as they get.
Yeah.
You're funneling this into turbines for this project, right? I've seen some hydrogen projects here and there, and there's a really interesting lot of really interesting things happening around hydrogen. And when we originally started talking about hydrogen, I think it was in the context of fuel cells. That's sort of where we had that big discussion. But there's a lot of opportunities just to straight up burn hydrogen, and it's a clean burn because it just produces water. But that said, burning it in a turbine to generate electricity in a standard turbine isn't necessarily as efficient, right, as using a fuel cell. So, I mean, with the kinds of storage capacities and power capacity that you have, and you're saying you could, continue to power the California grid for 3 days. I got to imagine the future of this, where we have more efficient conversion technologies, even down the road, that amount of storage may, last more, less significantly longer if we have more efficient, power conversion.
Yeah. No, that's a great point. And again, that's one of the other cool things about, our position in the market, is that we are seeing some of these technologies being developed. I'll give one example. There's a new turbine that's being developed. It's a linear generator. So it's not a spinning turbine, but imagine you've got a tube and you've got a device that's basically toggling back and forth. And
like a piston?
Yeah, almost like a piston. Right. And so they're that's just one example of some of the work that's being done. And in that particular case, I referenced that example because that turbine is designed to be a multi-fuel device. So that is also designed, again, for the hydrogen future, where it can burn 100%, and it can do this today, 100% hydrogen. So you're right. I mean, there are limits to the efficiency of combustion. There's the that pesky Frenchman Carnot. There's this thermodynamic principle that there's a Carno efficiency that you cannot exceed. So there are limits to the efficiency of any combustion process, but we are seeing some folks do some interesting work to really get more out of the fuel using solar or wind electrons. Going from electrons to produce go through the electrolysis process and then go through a mechanical combustion. You're losing a lot of energy along the way. And again, the only reason it makes sense in that case is because you have this massive storage repository. So the gain is that you have this repository of energy. But there are so many other really interesting uses for hydrogen that are today. Like, this is not a new thing. Hydrogen is used in the process to produce steel. It's one example. It's used in the refining process, right? It's kind of funny to think, Chris, about this idea that, hey, let's make some green hydrogen so we can use green hydrogen in the petroleum refining process. But oh, by the way, that is going to be happening. Some of the offtake for green hydrogen will be refining, and it will be steel making, and it will be cement processes, and it will be making ammonia.
Obviously, those are energy intensive because they require a tremendous amount of heat to produce like cement. Cement's in similar vein, right? A lot of these construction, but steel production is really very heat intensive. Is like the hydrogen something that you can use to burn to create the heat, or is it something that you produce electricity from and do it more through induction?
In these processes, it's used in different ways, but think of it as a chemical agent in these processes. It's not necessarily a fuel source. In some cases, it is, but it's more for the chemical properties and helping these materials go through a chemical metamorphosis. And so the hydrogen is used in that sense. So it's not even a traditional fuel source in the way that we think of, fuel cells or burning it in a turbine. It's being used for other purposes within these different processes.
It seemed like hydrogen was sort of first out of the gate with these, like the big hype around like clean energy, and then we kind of got into more like, just straight up electric, battery storage and that sort of thing, because hydrogen had some difficulties in that regard. And it seems like now we're coming back to the hydrogen, but it's at a different scale, and I think that's where I kind of make that distinction between like what we see in cars, which have a distinctly different kind of energy need versus large industry or, electric grid, supply.
Yeah.
Right. And it's interesting how the different types of fuels are lining up around their most optimal kind of use case.
Yeah.
And I think we're seeing this resurgence of hydrogen in a lot of really interesting areas.
Yeah.
Both from like as a fuel source to turn a turbine, or as a source of electrons through like a fuel cell. Yeah, it's hydrogen's making its big comeback right now. It seems like
it is, and we're seeing, we are, and again, I would argue yes and no to the idea of it making a comeback, because
it's always been here.
It's what we call gray hydrogen, which is gray hydrogen is the steam reformation of natural gas to produce to basically split the CH4 and produce hydrogen that way. So that is the common practice today. It's used quite a bit today. So I think that the comeback, so to speak, is really around this idea of producing it in a clean way. And the challenge
electrolysis.
The electrolysis. The bottom line is it's more expensive, right? It's about double the cost. Just some rough hand waving, roughly double the cost or more today to make what we call green hydrogen versus the existing infrastructure, the existing production of gray, or in the case of brown hydrogen, brown is produced from coal. So I would say, there's a healthy industry where there's hydrogen off takers. People are buying it today, and so the transition is more about, well, how are we making this stuff, and do we have our renewable? And this is the key, right? You mentioned renewables need to get less expensive, and they are, right. And that's a big part of what's happened. So why we're having this conversation about hydrogen is that the price of solar and wind has come down, steadily and substantially over the past, three decades. And so that's sort of making this possible. But we're seeing multinational agreements, the country of Korea. I'm not talking about like a couple of companies agree, but the country of Korea signing treaties with Australia and Oman for supply. So the scale has gotten really big because, the Koreans realize, hey, we don't have enough land to have enough renewables to make enough green hydrogen for all the, and they do make a lot of steel in Korea. So they need a lot of hydrogen. If they want to be green steel, they're going to have to import. So the scale has gotten really interesting. We're hearing about these projects that are many tens of gigawatts and just big numbers. And as a result, though, inevitably, right, the price will come down to a point where, I mean, this has happened in not all industries, but we see it over and over. Right, we've seen the price of electric vehicles come down as the numbers go up. We've seen solar. The price of solar has come down dramatically, and so we do expect a similar trend with hydrogen.
I like the idea of having that storage, like the vehicle for storage. And I was talking to another company it's doing some things around sort of natural gas extraction and stuff like that. And we talked about one of the things that could be in the future for them is sort of sequestering CO2 back into those things. But maybe the answer is putting hydrogen in those as a storage facility like the salt mines. But I mean, the thing is that natural gas production, obviously it stays in there and it's sealed up over millions of years, and that's methane largely, which is a bigger molecule, but it's holding that deep underground, a mile or two underground, and it's fairly easy to sort of extract that, right?
Yeah.
It's a low density gas that you could get out fairly easy. It seems like there's a lot of opportunities around the globe to sort of store things like this for maybe a more distributed grid down the road, which I would imagine would be great for you guys.
Sure. Well, yeah, absolutely. I think that sort of gets to an issue, which I think is interesting about hydrogen, which is that anyone can produce it. If I keep saying hydrogen, I mean to be saying green hydrogen, but whereas with we're seeing this in the battery space. We have precious metals that are concentrated in certain countries, and the classic example, not a good way, but the classic example is a lot of cobalt comes from the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the DRC, right. And there are a lot of questions about the practices, right? The labor practices in some places like that. And so
very significant questions, I will add.
Yes, these are big things that, as a society, we have to sort of wrestle with. But so it's one of the refreshing elements, I think, of hydrogen as a fuel. And again, look at natural gas. There are certain countries that are very wealthy in natural gas. The U.S. happens to be one of them. Hydrogen can be produced anywhere where you have the ability to produce renewable energy, green hydrogen. So in that sense, it is a more distributed asset. Although I gave the example of Korea, where they're going to need so much green hydrogen, they couldn't even produce it themselves. But that's one of the things that I find very encouraging, though, is that wherever you can put up solar or wind, which is most of the world, you have an opportunity to produce and then sell and export hydrogen.
So we've talked about electrolysis, and basically electrolysis works. You have, a positive and a negative, and an anode and a cathode kind of situation, right? And you electrify that, and the oxygen boils off over one of them. I forget whether it's anode or cathode, but then the hydrogen, twice as much hydrogen, right? H2O is produced on the other end. But those tend to be, I know that, sometimes it's like zinc and platinum and copper, are the metals that are all kind of involved in that, which are also precious metals. But I don't think it's not like a battery, or necessarily where those degrade as much, perhaps.
Right.
But maybe they do. I don't know. I don't know what the longevity of those things are and how much of them you need to.
Yeah, and the volume is a little bit less because it's a throughput process. But you're absolutely right. Yeah, even the electrolyzers and the fuel cells do have precious materials, and when in talking, that's what differentiates the different electrolyzer manufacturers is the secret sauce is in the material composition of those.
Right, because there's actually stuff you can add into the water as well to heighten that reaction. Right.
One thing that you just reminded me of, Chris, is that again talking about our role in this is feeding DC power into the electrolyzer. Somebody else makes the electrolyzer. And, one of the things that, as we talk about, how do we drive down the cost? When the production of green hydrogen is at the end of the day, between 60 and 80% of the cost of that is in the energy that's feeding it. So the OpEx, not so much the CapEx. CapEx is important, but the operating expenses, the cost of the renewables is the biggest single driver. So there's some interesting things being done, and we've been thinking about, for example, this question seems very obvious, but it's not as easy as it sounds. Is hey, solar energy. It's DC, right? The solar modules that you see on roofs and in fields, it's producing DC, and so they're using inverters to convert that to AC, and then the transformer to boost it up to medium voltage, and then away it goes on the grid. Yeah. And then in this case, we would be taking through a transformer, taking that medium voltage AC, converting it down to low voltage AC, and then converting it over to DC. Okay, a lot of steps. And you can just imagine all the losses that are involved in that. So we're working on a concept, sure. And we're actually doing a pilot project right now, which is kind of cool, where, okay, well, let's just skip the whole AC business and the whole medium voltage. Can we just take solar, DC electricity, run it through a DC-DC converter just to convert the voltages to what's needed by the electrolyzer, and then feed it directly into the electrolyzer? Basically, instead of having effectively 4 steps, 5, depending on how you count it, to basically having 1 step through a single converter. So that's one example of some of the innovation that's going on, and again, part of the fun stuff that we get to be involved in.
The old battle that took place between Tesla and Edison, between DC and AC current, and AC, which was Tesla's idea, eventually won out on that one because it helps run more, like motors and things like that, because you need AC current for that. But, if you look at sort of like what a lot of our modern energy consumption is, it's a lot of DC current. I mean, everything in a computer is DC. Yeah. So we're maybe it's a time to, start doing, although I would imagine long haul transmission of DC would be kind of a challenge, right?
It is. And yet, we do have this thing called HVDC, high voltage DC, in the case of, and there are a lot of these lines all over the world. I mean, listen, there are far fewer high voltage DC lines than there are high voltage AC lines, but it does make sense in a lot of cases, and including this example from Utah. But people may be aware of this now. But I mean, Texas is connected to the rest of the U.S. electrically through DC.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, so it's there are ways to use DC, and so DC is, I'm not going to say it's going through a renaissance, but what I just described to you, this idea of solar to electrolysis through DC, I call it a shortcut. Right, we're just going to do a shortcut, and we're pretty excited about that concept. We were originally involved. This whole DC direct concept we got involved with about 6 years ago on the solar to battery storage side. It's the same idea. Hey, wait a minute. If I'm going to charge up my batteries with solar, why am I taking my DC solar,
converting it and putting it back,
converting it, medium voltage, run it over here, come back down, and then we get to our batteries, and then so we pioneered this that's not the idea, but actually doing a commercial utility scale converter to actually do this, and that's also an interesting story about how that came to be. But when that happened, it sort of unlocked this whole idea of DC coupled solar plus storage, which is more efficient, and so we were pretty proud of that. And so we had sort of that obvious light bulb moment with hydrogen. Hey, why don't we do the same thing with hydrogen? So there's some important differences, but it's part of, I think, the fun of our job. I say ours, as a company, we get to be involved with some of these, industry shifting technologies.
And I will throw one more use case in there too. Data centers, like big multi-megawatt data centers, really are optimized with DC. Yeah, it's much more efficient to run DC in your data center than it is AC. But wow, this all sounds amazing. I love the idea of this hydrogen future, this clean hydrogen future, which is super cool. And I love the fact that you guys have some innovative new products that you're bringing to market to deliver on that. So that's very cool. So if folks want to find you, where do they go?
Well, I guess Dynapower.com. It's
Dynapower.com.
Pretty easy. And that's how folks would find us. And it's also worth mentioning, we're talking about, hey, we're part of this industry that's growing. And of course, we're growing. And so I always encourage folks that are thinking about getting into the space or in the space and looking for other opportunities. We're always hiring and looking to bring new talent on board. So I have to put in a plug.
Clean energy warrior, go find Dynapower and Chris, and he'll hook you up.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, I love the idea. Thanks so much for being on. Really appreciate it. This is a fun conversation for sure.
Chris, appreciate it.
Thanks for watching. I'd love to hear from you in the comments. And if you could, give us a like, think about subscribing, and I will see you in the next one.